Hello, welcome to my supplemental lecture series that I provide in connection with some of the material on that's provided with the Cat with No Teeth channel. I'd like to talk today about a sort of founding figure in the modern history of philosophy, a kind of a road point on the map of philosophy in its development from the Enlightenment onwards. Namely a French philosopher and physician named René Descartes. Descartes was very influenced by Greek philosophy, namely a school of skepticism in Greek philosophy by such philosophers to look up as Pyrrho and Socrates and so forth. But see, what interested Descartes wasn't purely to do with skepticism. It was confronting skepticism and confronting the challenge of skepticism to knowledge, to epistemology, and to other branches of philosophy. And so Descartes came up with a kind of thought experiment stroke meditational catharsis, or catharsis was kind of a Greek word to do with like purification of the mind. And Descartes was one of the foremost people in the academic fields in France and in Europe, and he had such great knowledge of science and of physiology that he naturally brought his two influences together and confronted his own scientific knowledge. He asked, well, could this knowledge be subjected to reasonable doubt? Could this edifice of knowledge that we perceive as functional, as kind of pseudonymously complete, is this incomplete edifice of science something that can be disassembled with skepticism? And for example, Descartes spoke about our knowledge from the senses, because David Hume famously said that everything comes through our senses and from experience. And Descartes said, well, can we actually doubt the information that our senses are giving us? And he looked at the imperfections of perception and said, well, look, we cannot rely 100% on our senses. In fact, much less, because we in philosophical terms, we could be dreaming, because when we're in a state of dreaming, it's very difficult to perceive that we are dreaming, and we're kind of fooled by our dreams into a sort of a belief state. And therefore, can we actually be sure that the real world exists beyond perception, if you like? Another thinker to think about is Berkeley, Bishop Berkeley, who spoke about to be is to be perceived, and for example, the example of a tree falling over in the forest when there isn't anyone to perceive it. I mean, you might say, well, animals perceive it, but is animal perception the same as human perception? I mean, would an animal know if it were dreaming or not? Would any of us know? But so therefore, our perception and our ideas of existence are kind of linked together in that you can look at something like a field like quantum physics, and quantum physics, our perception can change the nature of what we perceive at a quantum level. The behavior of light can be perceived as a wave or as a particle, depending on how we perceive it. And therefore, Descartes started looking more into our existence and said, well, what exactly can't we doubt? Is there anything that we can't doubt? Or can doubt, prune back the rose bush until there is no rose bush, as it were. Descartes believed that an evil demon could be deceiving him at any point, and therefore, the problem of dreams and the problem of our belief states, rears its head with the spectre of deception. And but what Descartes postulated that he could not doubt was, in some sense, that he was just doubting, and that's all. The fact that he was in some cognitive state of doubt is the one thing that he could not, find some problem with, pick some hole in, and ultimately deconstruct to a point of not coming up to a standard of epistemology. Now, epistemology is a discipline of philosophy to do with the status of knowledge and the status of wisdom and the status of opinion and the relationships between them, and the process of opinion rising up through into knowledge and wisdom. And Descartes said, well, look, a philosophical standard of epistemology, the world doesn't come up to that. The world is a mysterious and obtuse and unclear and easily misperceivable thing, and our logic is in similar ways fallible, in the sense that disciplines like science and all our disciplines are in some sense incomplete, and based on hypothesis and on conjecture and on as the things as far as we know them to be now. We're limited by the world we live in, the state of the world as providing sufficient reasons for the world to be the way it is. It's like we're not the end of the story. We're like a puzzle that the pieces are still going into. Anyway, so Descartes says, well, the one thing he can't doubt is that he's doubting, and therefore from this he comes to the conclusion that in terms of ontology, remember we've moved from epistemology to more an ontological statement about existence. He is a thinking thing of some description. And remember, Descartes harked back to Aristotle and our Aristotelian notions of metaphysics and of substance and so forth, and different types of substance. And so he would say he was a kind of thinking Aristotelian substance, because of the evidence of being a doubter, from being a skeptic itself, that all we can really know is that some kind of mental activity is going on. But I mean, you're still stuck in the possibility that we could be living in a solipsistic world. Solipsism's to do with the idea that a skeptical idea that we are the only ones that really exist, and everything else is some kind of apparition or dream, as back to dreams. But so we've got this question of epistemology and ontology. For example, saying what I can know is the status of what exists. And you see, this is where Descartes' a bit stuck between two great tectonic plates of philosophy, epistemology and ontology. But Descartes still wants to say, well, look, having epistemological value, having status of our ability of reason to understand the world, is also the basis of our beliefs to do with us to do with the Aristotelian substance and so forth, and therefore he's stuck at this juncture point, and Descartes comes up with the cogito, or cogito ergo sum, which is, he says, well, I think, therefore I am. And you see, this is a very special statement, because you can see where I think and I am are meeting together. And Descartes saying, well, because epistemology is our most deepest notions, our knowledge of existence comes from our ability to conceive, our ability to think. So it's like our ability to think establishes what ontology actually is, and defines ontology in some way, defines existence, because it's dependent upon epistemology. Now you can see where there's a sort of woolly edges to Descartes' thought, in that well, is that telling us everything about existence? I mean, or do we have a primal emotional sense of existence, as the existentialists will argue, that is just as basic as our knowledge that we are some kind of cogitating entity, an entity of cognitation. But do we have a sense of existence that's deep within our emotional primal feelings, that is in some sense defines how we understand who we are, our identity, we're kind of a locus. A locus is an arrangement of points around a central point, and we're kind of a locus around some kind of question mark, because all Descartes really gets to the bottom of is the fact that, well, we're not quite sure anyway. But if we're this question mark, then all our experiences are different points that are related to that individual point. And therefore, Immanuel Kant, I believe, argued that Descartes was making a category mistake, in the sense of how I spoke of earlier, between epistemology and ontology, a mistake of conceptuality, using the wrong conceptual tool, as I spoke about in the first lecture. But they do seem to be intimately related together, ontology and epistemology, in Descartes' equation, in that, well, it's a dependency relation on epistemology, how our knowledge of our ontology is shaped, how it is conceived of. And Descartes was holding a piece of wax at the time and moulding it with his hands. And I think he thinks that epistemology kind of moulds ontology in a similar way. And so therefore you've got a kind of two-way relation, just from the fact that there's a one-way relation. Because, Descartes, ontology affects our epistemology as well, in some sense. In that if things change in our life, then that changes our epistemological perspective. So it's really a kind of two-way thing, whereas Descartes wants to say, well, is this dependency relation puts epistemology first, because it limits what we can understand about ontology. But then we've got this more primal understanding of the world that doesn't seem to be coming at that same sort of cognitive level. Remember, I spoke in my first lecture, if you've seen my first lecture, it might help if you see it, to do with it being like a tree, with our higher level thought being like the crown of the tree, and our trunk being like the conveyance of our wisdom up the tree, our refinement of knowledge, and how we get from the very basic information our experiences and people's opinion in order to conjecture about knowledge and so forth. But anyway, you'll have your own opinions about whether Descartes succeeds or whether Kant's criticism is salient. But